Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IUCEL 2022. As you're all informed, this is the last day of our 3 days event. I hope that you had fun enjoying the gather town and also networking with people around. It is my pleasure to be a moderator for the session this afternoon. The title is Towards Learning Analytics in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. It is a pleasure for us to have Professor Dr. Dragan Gasevic, who is a professor of learning analytics in the Faculty of Information Technology and director of the Center for Learning Analytics at Monash University. He is a founder and served as the president of the Society for Learning Analytics Research, also known as SOLAR. He has also held several honorary appointments in Asia, Australia, Europe, and North America. In 2019 to 2021, he was recognized as the National Field Leader in Educational Technology in the Australian's Research magazine. He led the EU-funded Sheila project that received the Best Research Project of the Year award in 2019 from the Association for Learning Technology. In 2022, he received the Lifetime Member Award, the highest distinction of SOLAR. Dragan's research interests center around the development of computational methods that can advance understanding of self-regulated and collaborative learning. Personally, it is like a dream comes true for me to be able to have a session together with Prof. Dragan today, because over the years, I've been reading only his papers. I believe many of you who has gathered around today is anticipating this session as well, as learning analytics is mushrooming in Malaysia. So without further ado, I don't want to steal the time. Let us pass to the Professor Dr. Dragan Gasevic as our honorary speaker for his session. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction and for the honor to speak to you today. I'm going to be speaking today about learning analytics, and I'm going to be trying to have a bit of a framing of learning analytics in the age of AI and some opportunities, benefits, and potentially how we can navigate our journey as we are going on that road. So most of us are, to a certain extent, familiar with many issues that we are dealing with education, higher education, and across many different levels. We are basically living in far more complex times where we are seeing far more integration across the board with many different types of technologies, but at the same time also complexities in terms of relationships between different people, different countries, different workplaces, and so on. And at the same time, there's far more pressure on the individuals to engage into learning, not only throughout their formal education, but also even beyond the scope of that. And that's basically what is characteristic for the age of AI, or where we are seeing far more automation, that people will be required to upskill and reskill far more frequently than they used to in the past. And many who are clearly in our networks and students are also turning to formal education again, and that creates a fair bit of pressures as well on us to educate more and more students than ever, but at the same time, even with less resources than ever. And so then the question basically is that we often turn into technology to help us with some of these issues, but when we are dealing with technology, like I'm now talking to you as well, and I don't really see many of your faces at all. And this is not a criticism of you or any of the organizers. This is just a limitation of the technology that we are dealing with. And that really means that the feedback loops that exist between students and educators are missing or weakening over time. And so what we try to do in learning analytics is we are trying to really look into the opportunities that are emerging from the data that are available inside or produced as a byproduct of the interactions of the people with digital technologies. Most of schools and higher education institutions have certain technologies that are typically using. They have some form of learning environment that is typically some form of learning management system. Those are the Moodles of the world. And then we also have typically some student information systems where we keep some of the data about our students, what they are doing, how they are doing, what grades they get, whether they are absent, and so on. But many of us, especially in the last 2 years, particularly focused on the introduction of a range of other technologies, trying to prepare our students to deal with certain social media, how they are navigating social media. There are plenty of the threats as well, and also how to trust information there. They also need to find relevant and reliable information in that space. We want them to be reflective practitioners as well. We want them to use lots of multimedia at the same time, have lots of interactions with their peers and trying to do many things with them. So whenever we do with these type of technologies, we mostly leave lots of digital footprints. Those are the traces about, for example, the pages we saw, clicks we made, sometimes even keystrokes that we pressed as we were dealing with some of these technologies. And the point of learning analytics is that we would like to make use of these digital footprints, analyze them with some techniques that are coming from artificial intelligence / machine learning or network science, natural language processing, and then try to make certain interpretations, try to get the insights that can inform feedback that can be eventually fed back to our students and our educators. So just this is a basic gist of learning analytics and what we are trying to do. But as we now all know what we mean by learning analytics, let us just explore a bit what are the common themes or topics that we can say in learning analytics. And these common themes is the most popular one from the early days of learning analytics is prediction and description of outcomes and the processes. In particular, many have been interested in predicting the extent to which some students are at risk of failing a course or a whole degree early in a course or their degree program. And the idea is basically then to build some form of early warning systems, like some of these early warning systems that were called course signals that would be offering almost like a metaphor of traffic lights, and trying to basically prevent students from failing those units or withdrawing from them. And this is just a very now old study as well from 2012, which demonstrated significant benefits of the introduction of one such system, which is called course signals, for an engineering cohort of about 5,000 students. And we can actually see on this diagram as well that they demonstrated savings, or better to say, the numbers of students who managed to complete the whole degree program and who had at least one unit with a system like this, which would be providing early warning alerts to both students and the teaching staff, had about 10 to 15% on average better performance than those who never used this type of a system. There are today, of course, many systems like this. Many organizations around the world as well implemented them, and they are particularly useful. There's another really growing field or sub-area of learning analytics, and that's trying to mine learning strategies to understand what kind of really ways our learners are using when they are interacting with different types of resources we are offering them, and the extent to which they are engaging, for example, into deep learning, and the extent to which they are engaging into some productive so-called learning techniques that can potentially enhance and or maximize some of their learning outcomes. And then there's also lots of emphasis and really some interesting work. I'm going to be talking today much more about that as well, about the measurement of certain 21st century skills. I'd say that personalized feedback at scale and adaptive learning support is probably one of the highlights where we saw some of the best achievements in the field of learning analytics. And that's where we are trying to provide personalized feedback that can be scaled up at large numbers, hundreds or even thousands of students, by empowering the teaching teams where they need to write feedback, but where they are supporting thousands of students, but their workload is not growing that exponentially. Their workload is actually growing as if they have 4 or 5 students, up to 10 students to write feedback for, and yet that feedback scales up to hundreds or thousands and feels very personal. One of those open source solutions that is available, led by our colleague Abelardo Pardo from the University of South Australia a few years ago already, and it's been used already by many tens, I think, institutions around the world that are using it to personalize feedback at scale and empower their teaching staffs to deal with the scale of their teaching, their offering and the numbers of students. The final topic I'm going to mention that received profound attention in the field of learning analytics is emphasis on ethical use of learning analytics, on privacy protection, and really policy and the ways how we can deal with that. There are many useful resources out there. One of the first was JISC Code of Practice, JISC being a non-departmental agency in the UK that is providing technology support to higher education sector. There have been many different useful documents produced in Europe as well, like the delicate checklist that provides advice the extent to which we can and should consider certain points on our journey to make sure that we are making certain decisions ethically and also protect the privacy of the individuals. And finally, we did also some work on this topic inside of the project, which was named Sheila, which produced a framework that allows higher education institutions to form their policy and strategy in the ways how they are using and dealing with learning analytics. So as you can see, I mean, learning analytics gained a fair bit of attention, and especially in the last 4 or 5 years, when we are seeing far more proliferation of the use of artificial intelligence and the promise of artificial intelligence to different sports of lives as well as education, and now even in learning analytics. So we see really lots of promise and high interest in that topic. Then the question then becomes is, how do we grow learning analytics in the age of AI? And what do we need to do and what kind of steps we need to take? So I'm going to take us to a potential one exploratory journey today, and I'm going to discuss with you today about one possible direction we need to take. And to do that, I'm going to be following the model that with a few colleagues I created several years ago to basically help us have the conversations about learning analytics and to help us have conversations about adoption of learning analytics. And generally, this model promotes the idea that there are generally 3 key areas or 3 steps we need to be thinking about. Number 1 being, what kind of data can we collect and potentially use? How we can analyze these data with different types of models that come from machine learning and artificial intelligence, and then how the insights obtained through these data analysis can be used to transform our practice, our certain educational processes, and the way how we are doing things in learning and teaching. And obviously, this process doesn't stop at the transformation. Once we have transformed, we again want to collect more data to understand whether our transformation was effective. We again try to analyze the efficacy of that transformation, and then we again try to change more. So this is like almost like a spiral indefinite loop that is trying to basically always collect the data, understand the impact of it, and tries to continue the transformation process. So I'm going to step us through these 3 key areas and what we need to think about. Number 1 is the data, and we need to have access to data. Many of you are probably using certain learning management systems such as Moodle, and you might also have some other learning management systems. There is data behind it about your students, but you need to get access to that data. The data tells you precisely at one point in time students accessed certain resources that you provided with them, what kind of also contributions students had both in different types of assessments, online discussions, and so on. And similar can be told for other types of digital technologies. And I'm going to also mention how it can be done in the physical space in a moment. And so the key thing is, though, that you have a good support from the IT inside of your institution, and to make sure as well that even when you're acquiring potentially some new digital technologies, that you have good access to data. But the key thing that you need to pay attention to, though, is that you need to have good quality data as well inside of it, meaning that if you, for example, are interested to use the data from Moodle or any learning management system, and you did not design any meaningful activities for your students to do on Moodle, meaning that it's not just enough for students to go there and, for example, download a slide deck and then go back, that will not be particularly useful data point for you. Then no matter how sophisticated AI algorithms you are going to apply to your data to torture it, if the quality of your data is not good and your data could not capture sufficient good type of students' activities that you are interested in, then AI is not going to help you. So you really need to think about the quality of the data. And the quality of data goes hand in hand very much so with a good quality learning design, meaning you need to be very careful about thinking what kind of activities I need my students to take so that they can produce evidence in form of the data that they completed these activities. And then I can use those data to analyze how they are tracking and how they are performing. And for the same price, you're also getting the improved learning design. So that's really, really important. This is a common principle that is used also in the assessment literature. The other, of course, thing is to think about better quality instrumentation of the learning environments and the tools that you may have. And that may then help you to do it both in the physical and the digital learning spaces. Meaning that often, while you may have lots of clicks, and these clicks might be telling you whether students are learning better or worse, that might not be sufficient often. And then to do that, you sometimes want to really understand what is the level of motivation of my students, or what is the level of, for example, perceived cognitive load that my students have to complete certain activities. And this is just a simple widget that we used in many of the courses that we've been experimenting with. And we basically, upon completion of any activity, we would ask students to just click in one of these four quadrants in this diagram. And these quadrants would tell us basically whether students found something really difficult and they felt that they are now discouraged that they can even complete the whole course. And that basically means that we are behind these questions hiding measurement of cognitive load and self-efficacy. And what basically happens, why would students give you this extra data point? Well, there's a clear quid pro quo there for students. One is that once they actually have given you this data point, you can actually see, there are these 40% of students in my class who found this really difficult. So I better cover this next time in some other lesson so that these students can catch up, or I can provide them with even extra feedback. And even more so, this data point becomes potentially a bookmark for students to actually know, oh, I need to go back and plan to revise some of these points that I was wondering that they are difficult to me. Or I can ask the questions later to my teaching team as well. And the similar type of interface can be used in a physical or online room. So this could be really, really useful, and we found it exceptionally useful. Of course, you can go much more high tech, and you can instrument your students in your classrooms. And we are instrumenting both our normal classrooms, but as well as some specialized simulation-based learning classrooms as well that are used typically for clinical simulations. So this is one example of an ongoing project that we have, in which we are collecting the data from different types of sensors, the positions or the locations that students are taking when they are working in a team, then their physiological response. We are also recording their speech to understand how they are communicating as part of the teamwork activity. And then we are also tracking how they are interacting with the certain mannequins or the simulators that are supposed to be working with. And then based on that, we are collecting the data that can be helpful for student reflection. So this is the first set of things. This is not necessarily much specific to data, to artificial intelligence, but to be honest, whoever tells you that you can get good quality artificial intelligence without good quality data, they are not really engaging into this topic seriously. So this is really, really essential thing. So you need to have good quality data to be able to engage into good quality or get good quality benefits of the artificial intelligence. And so then the second thing is, this is basically when we are talking about modeling and meaning like application of different types of machine learning that are typically used for predictive modeling. And to predict the extent to which students can be at risk of failing a course, or the extent to which they are going to get some good or bad grades in certain courses, or even to classify students' messages, whether they are asking good questions or questions about the procedural things, or questions that require like really good expertise from the team to answer them in terms of the subject to domain that is relevant, and you can then use that for triage. It's really, really, really important to think about the context in which that data is collected and how things could be done. So by that context, I really mean the subject domains that you are trying to have, and also instructional conditions. We had several studies on this topic, and also several others went on to replicate that. And it is really important that understand that you cannot create a predictive model that can be used effectively for every unit or every subject in your university or in your school. But instead, what we basically found is that instructional conditions shape really much how students are going to engage into certain activities online or in physical space. And thus, the footprints that students are leaving in one class will be completely different from the others. Meaning, if you ask in some of the classes to use much more video and online discussions, while in others you are primarily focused, for example, on different types of e-books to be read, etc., these students are going to have different types of traces and activities. And even if you use super cool deep learning, machine learning models, they are not going to be very helpful to you to identify predictors that are common or that are highly important why some of these students are potentially failing to complete the course or not. In some of our previous studies, what we found is if you try to create these generalized models across the board, you can get some level of predictive accuracy. In our study, we found on average, we were getting to explain about 25%, 23 to 25% of the variance in students' final grades, and not so bad, like predictive accuracy of students at risk of failing a course, something in the range of 80%. But the only significant predictor would be the number of logins to the learning management system. And that's not particularly beneficial for anybody who's teaching practice. But when you actually try to separate these individual courses across different subjects and so on, you actually can get far greater accuracy. In some cases, we were able to explain about 75% of students' grades based on these online activities, and even get really deep insights why these grades and how these grades can be explained. And in some other cases, we would get 0%. Why? Because in some cases, people don't use the LMS. They don't use that particular environment for their activities because it's not particularly beneficial. Like, for example, in our case, there was a course of graphical design, and they said we use completely specialized environment for teaching graphical design. So that's really important. The other more recent study even reiterated that it's not just the instructional conditions, even when you control for relatively similar instructional conditions across the board, students' individual differences are actually explaining almost 70% of the students' outcomes. And often we don't have sufficient consideration in our analysis or the collection of the types of data about these internal conditions of our students' motivation or good study skills or cognitive load, the type of things that I was suggesting previously in my talk as well. We are not really collecting that type of data, and that's really, really essential. So then the question becomes is, how that can be mitigated. Is there any hope for us to do that? Well, I'll argue here that there's a fair bit of opportunity here to make use of artificial intelligence to assess or to find out what kind of learning strategies our students are following. Often, learning strategies can be defined in many different ways, but one way to think about them is also in terms of the terminology of approaches to learning, whether they are following deep approaches to learning or surface approaches to learning. Or the other way is to frame it from the perspective of the time management and the extent to which, for example, students are trying to amass their learning in a small period of time, and that typically doesn't result in long-term memory retention or long-term even transfer of skills, or they are trying to space some of their learning. So this is really a good opportunity. I had a pleasure from your beautiful country to supervise a PhD student who's done an exceptional work when I was still with the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Anurayu Ahmad-Dazir. And so she did really some groundwork with me and several other colleagues in the team who were working on that topic and proposed a number of different algorithms and number of different approaches that could be highly beneficial for that process. So one of the key principles in this process to understand and identify learning strategies is really a combination of fairly sophisticated machine learning techniques and data mining techniques. So typically, it's a combination of some form of unsupervised machine learning, also known as clustering, with some form of sequence mining, process mining, and network analysis. And why we are talking about sequence mining, process mining, network analysis? Because we really want to understand how our students are doing things over the longer period of time. We don't want to just say students access this page 25 times. We are far more interested in how they first navigated, whether they initially went to see the course requirements, whether they read the learning objectives that they needed to follow, whether they then navigated to complete the activity and then return back to see these objectives, because it's telling us a lot about the way how they are self-regulating their learning and how they are making good judgments. And this is really important if you want to provide a meaningful feedback to them to make sure that they are actually improving their learning. So what we found as part of this research is we found a number of interesting things. First of all, that we can detect certain learning strategies, and smaller granular points would be tactics as well that students are following. And they are deeply associated with the opportunities that we provide for students inside of our learning environments, meaning students are going to typically do things on Moodle or any learning management system, or even the physical classroom, that are in accordance to the learning designs or the activities that you envision for them to be doing. They will not be diverging hugely from it. Of course, they may diverge is basically in terms of their time management. So what we see that learning strategies are really tightly linked with the way how students are manage their time. So whether they are doing certain things before the lectures, if you're trying to flip your classrooms, or they are doing that delayed and they are trying to catch up, or they are doing it really ahead of the time as well. So we also know that's one really important thing. What we also know is that students are really regulating fairly consistently their learning strategies across different contexts. So while some of these individual things may differ from one course to another course, consistently their strategies are very, very similar across many courses. And typically these strategies can be best explained in terms of the approaches to learning and even personality they are associated with. So approaches to learning, typically deep approach to learning and surface approach to learning are common types of strategies. What we also found time and time again across many different contexts is that learning strategies are really well associated with academic performance, meaning that they are really also good predictors of academic performance. What we also know is that the choice of learning strategy can be influenced by the personalized feedback that we are potentially offering to the learners at scale. I'm going to touch shortly about that personalized feedback at scale. So meaning that I have potentially a power that can be used with learning analytics that can not only identify the learning strategies students are following, but I can shift them to embrace more positive learning strategies. What we can also see is that we can explain nicely some of these learning strategies, tactics. We basically experimented. We can actually see clearly that certain students, when they're engaged really well into the deep strategies to learning, they are also really following and exhibiting good, deep mechanisms of self-regulated learning, while in other cases that is not the case. And why is that not the case? Because they often don't really monitor well how they are doing things. They are more careless in terms of self-assessing their own performance, the outcomes, and also they're making much poorer choices in terms of time management and the way how they are going, whether they are going to read or they are trying to also revise certain information. And what we also found is that the use of mining or the assessment of learning strategies from these trace data can be really helpful to evaluate the effectiveness of learning designs that are currently available there. And we also evaluated that across different contexts. So the other opportunity that I see for artificial intelligence is to help us to measure learning progression. And when I say learning progression, doesn't mean whether students are increasing the number of clicks. I think the number of clicks is really irrelevant measure. The much more relevant measure is the construct that we are trying to measure, whether we want to improve the learning strategy of our students, whether we want to improve their self-regulation, obviously in the hope for better performance and the hope of many of them also more graduating, but you really need to pay attention to the quality of their learning. And so I'm gonna just think a little bit with you about one example, and one of the types of approaches we were looking is in terms of the learning progression. One of the PhD students I had when I was still with the University of Edinburgh, Janie Sinclair, she was looking in particular the extent to which tutors and students can really align well their language, their speech, when the students are trying to learn English as second language. And basically, the idea of that interlocutor alignment is that the higher level of alignment we can get between the student and the learner, the higher also ability of the learner it is. And to do so, then we were basically expecting to see that symmetry between learners and the tutor's language. And to do that, what we were doing in particular, we were then analyzing what kind of dialogue acts students are engaging and using, and what kind of dialogue acts tutors are using. And this was basically in a physical face-to-face interaction with the students, and then we were using the transcripts of these to analyze. And so what we basically wanted to see is within one tutoring session, and then dividing that tutoring session of about half an hour or 1 hour, in each quarter of that session, what was the level of alignment of the language of these students? We used one of the more advanced learning analytics techniques, which is called epistemic network analysis, which basically looks for, in this case, between each utterance, each turn, when students or tutors would be saying something and using certain dialogue acts, how they are basically connecting these dialogue acts across the board. And then we can apply some fairly sophisticated computational technique that we actually are not going to discuss about much today, but we can eventually produce these nice diagrams. And you can see in this diagram, on the left-hand side, we have the tutors, and on the right-hand side, the blue ones, we have the students or the learners. And we can see that basically in this two-dimensional latent variable space, tutors are from the first quarter of their discussion until the fourth quarter of the discussion or conversation, trying to use more and more and more similar language as their students. They are trying to simplify that language and trying to establish a rapport. But you can see that the learners, the blue ones, they're pretty much stuck at the same point. They really don't have the vocabulary and they don't have these skills. Similar happens when students are on level 2. And the difference between level 1 and level 2 is 1 year of the formal language learning instruction. However, things become much more interesting on level 3. You can see that the students and the learners are really, by the end of the conversation, getting almost close to each other. They start using very similar language. And this is what happens basically on level 4. At the end of their conversation, they are almost joined up on the same level. And this type of analysis can give us really very rich, deep insights into the constructs that matter about the learning. They are not telling us what is the quantity of their interactions. They are not telling us how many times they said certain word. They're really telling us the extent to which they are aligning, students are capable to align with a tutor. And then for each of these dots that you can see here, we can actually get a very nice and visualized network. I'm happy to discuss about that later, but also you can find it in this reference that I'm citing here. We did a fair bit of similar analysis for this to measure learning progression. So we basically published how this can be applied for collaborative problem solving on online discussions. So we can see how certain roles students play online, as well as how certain interventions you may have are improving or not collaborative problem solving. And also how students are, if you assign them certain roles in collaboration, like some students need to be leaders, other students need to be moderators of certain activities, other students could be devil advocates and so on. How students are performing these activities, which of these roles are potentially beneficial to the students, and the extent to which students are aligned with each other. What we so far, on the other hand, don't know so much in learning analytics, and although it's a mainstream in the broader machine learning and artificial intelligence, is to use deep machine learning, we actually use it to a lesser extent. And I think this is a really good opportunity that we need to investigate it much better and much more. We found in some of our existing studies that we are not, in certain cases, getting so much benefit from deep machine learning when we spend time in really preparing well our data for the application of the conventional machine learning. And even if we get some benefits, the challenge potentially for many of us is to think about whether we can explain the insights we are getting from deep machine learning, because these models are usually not so explainable. And the other thing is also even conventional, but also equally so deep machine learning models may actually be very susceptible to bias that is reflective of the inequities that we have already in our societies, or the bias also that can be imposed by the decisions that machine learning specialists or other data analysts may impose by making certain decisions about the data, or just the models themselves on a certain data set might impose certain biases. So these are really important challenges, but I think promising as well if you are looking for opportunities to do some form of future research. And the final section of my talk will be focused on the transformation. So we collected good quality data. We obtained certain insights from our analysis. So what do we do now? Well, I think for many people, even this diagram that I showed before, as much as I was excited about epistemic network analysis, might not be particularly clear. So we need to really create analytics tools that are good for non-statistics experts. And the first thing for many people comes to mind is that, well, why don't we have good old dashboards? Dashboards that are typically trying to plot comparisons of the students and comparing them with the class average or with the cohort average or the expectations, etc. Well, the reality is, though, that research showed, and there are plenty of the studies here, is that in many cases, these dashboards can be harmful if they are carelessly handed to the students. The reason for that could be a multitude of the things, but one of them is students are underperforming and they see that they are also really lowly performing. That can be really harmful to them. At the same time, it's the opposite effect for the students who are performing really well. It can be really good and beneficial for their motivation. Just an example, a randomized controlled trial conducted at Stanford University and published in 2018 demonstrated that a dashboard that they developed in their university had a negative effect on students' GPA. And their dashboard basically tried for each course in the university to present some data about the average workload or the workload distribution students had, typical grade distribution, and many other types of information. So we really, really, really need to be careful who we are providing some data to and what kind of that data needs to be incorporated in it. My critical point here is that we really need to make sure that we have this so-called human in the loop as the key approach, that we need to have much more robust design approaches of these AI-driven learning analytics technologies that are aiming to really enhance our learning and teaching practices, but at the same time also provide better opportunities for the end users to make much better informed decisions. And in many of these cases, we primarily at this stage target the teachers and the teaching staff in higher education to make some of these decisions rather than to directly offer some of this data to the students, just because we want to try to minimize the harm that some of these studies demonstrated that that kind of provision of the data may have. This is just one example of an environment that was created by a group out of the University of Wisconsin led by David Schaefer, and also a work that was led by one of the lecturers in our team in the Center for Learning Analytics at Monash, while he was still doing the PhD at Wisconsin. And the idea is that they actually wanted to support students to have these so-called virtual internships, which is really a well-established concept in the literature, in the learning sciences, and it aims to provide very immersive game type of environment for the learners so they can get very simulated internship experience. So one of these experiences they were doing is also to have students who are deployed, for example, in urban design offices and built environment offices. And these students then need to engage with a range of different stakeholders. And these stakeholders then need to be consulted. They need to then also use some specialized tools and then make certain decisions. But as students are chatting with these different stakeholders, sending emails, also using and generating other types of data, they're automatically analyzing these type of data with similar techniques that I already talked about. And then they are creating this on this diagram here. It's called simplified epistemic network. They are looking at the extent to which, for example, students are making balanced decisions. They are making based on the analysis of the relationships between different stakeholders. They are using certain indicators to justify decisions, or they are also making justifications for their decisions based on the input of the stakeholders. But then not only do they do that, but the system itself is offering the recommendation to the teaching team or the teacher, depending on the level of the education this is used at, what recommendations they can offer to the students. And then the teacher can moderate that decision and provide best pedagogical advice that is informed by data. The other approach is that even when you get the data about these students' learning strategies that I said, and this type of insight, you still need to somehow feed it back to your learners. And this is the work we did with the colleague Abelardo Pardo I mentioned before. And this is the open source solution, which is called OnTask, which allows the teacher to write a set of rules for the students for each task. Say in every week, if you are teaching in higher education, you may have 5 or 6 tasks for your students to complete certain quizzes, watch certain videos, to do some readings, and so on. So then you can actually just use very simple indicators for that, even without sophisticated mining of learning strategies and everything that I talked about, but it can be, of course, done as well. And then for each of, for example, in this example that I'm giving you, you may divide your students into the quartiles based on their engagement or their level of performance and so on. And so for each of these quartiles on a given task, so you're writing these, the number of these feedback messages is not driven by the number of students you have, but by the number of the tasks you have. Then Once you have written these snippets of feedback, then there is a relatively simple script algorithm that matches the profile or properties of a student with the snippet of feedback for that student and compiles a message. And then each student receives, in our case, automated email like this. So this is really one of the approaches that we've so far seen. And what we've so far seen as well is that this approach is highly appreciated by the students in terms of their perceived value of the feedback. We also saw a significant increase in the more productive learning strategies in the students, and also in several cases as well, significant improvement in the students' learning outcomes. So it's an overall win-win for everybody, addressing some of the pressing needs for the teaching teams and the educational institutions, but at the same time, not imposing a huge amount of the workload on the teaching teams. The key question, on the other hand, is that we really need to be building our so-called data and AI literacy. And we need to really get to know how AI can best be used for different tasks and how the teachers, and as well as even our students, can be most effectively doing their work with the support of AI. At the same time, AI can be beneficial as well to upskill us as educators. So AI, for example, can be really, really beneficial to help us improve our feedback literacy, the way how we are sharing feedback to our students, the way how our students receive and even share back their feedback as a part of the dialogic feedback conceptualization there's contemporary in educational research. AI then can really help us to analyze that feedback. And we had already multiple different studies in different languages as well that look the way how we can see whether those who are writing feedback, whether they are students or the teachers, whether they are following some properties of good practice or the best levels of feedback according to different according to the literature and the existing best evidence that is coming from the literature on feedback. The other opportunity that I see as we are going forward is really emphasis more on the automatic feedback, that we are actually going to automate some of this feedback. But what we know so far in the literature on automatic feedback is that, well, we can actually see that automatic feedback indeed can increase students' performance across many different types of activities. There's also no evidence that manual feedback is more efficient or effective than automatic feedback, meaning you can actually use some of these automatic feedback tools and you shouldn't be worried that you are going to cause a huge damage. At the same time, there's also no evidence that automatic feedback eases instructors' workload or teachers' workload as well. And that's something that we need to pay attention to carefully by thinking, oh, we are going to do this AI system in the class and thus problem solved. Well, often the teacher and the educational designer or the instructor need to think about how they are pedagogically going to incorporate that technology inside of the system, inside of their class, and also even how to get the insight to help the students as well. Because even though these automatic feedback technologies can be helpful, they still require additional support to be provided to our students. And then there's another one, that most of these existing things that are available is mostly focused on the correctness of the answer, which is really not particularly useful for many domains. What you want to do is you are not just looking whether students said number 5 is the correct answer, but you also want to tell them like if their writing is offering sufficient level of reflective writing properties or sufficient level of critical thinking and so on, and how it's cohesive. And needs to be also provided with the guidance, what next steps they need to take to improve their learning. The final point before I start concluding my talk today is I really want to say that artificial intelligence and some of these algorithms through mining of the learning strategies and then seeing the impact on certain types of interventions and transformations can be really helpful for us to measure like what is the quality of that intervention on learning strategies, on time management, on self-regulation, on collaborative learning, on language learning. So we've seen a range of these different types of things that we can actually measure the efficacy of everything. All right, so I'm coming to the conclusion of my talk and just a couple of key things. I hope I made a case for you that AI offers much potential to advance learning analytics and thus education. But at the same time, I also hope that I emphasized enough that the learning analytics, regardless of AI or not, is the place where education, good design, and artificial intelligence must meet if we want to have the most and the highest benefits of the learning analytics. Thanks so much for your attention. And if there's any time left, I'm happy to take any questions.
Wow, Prof. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I've been busy taking notes and snapshots and also searching, but mostly I'm bursting with excitement trying to see all the possible opportunities and challenges that AI can offer for learning analytics, especially the part when you mentioned that AI can and should be helping for intervention, for personalized learning to really take place. Allow me to open the floor for any question first. If there is anyone wants to ask any question, there are some written questions here, but if there is no oral question, I'll read through the written one.
Yeah.
Maybe one oral question, please. Anyone? No? Okay, if there is none, allow me to read this question for everyone to benefit. Questions from Dr. Manraj Singh. He is an e-learning enthusiast. How may we bridge the transition gap of learning analytics cycles into actionable strategies?
A terrific question. It's a hard task as well. There are a couple of things that need to be met. It's not just the question of like high-tech technical skills that we need to have, but it's much more on the two things. I'd call that basically some form of learning analytics literacy, which really means understanding of the insight obtained from the data, as well as understanding of the learning design. That's one level of it, but often learning analytics gives us insights that are going beyond the learning design and are requiring additional resources. Students need to additional counseling, additional advising, and so on. So that really then implies the second important thing is that we need to also have the form of the culture as well, data culture inside of our school systems or educational systems as well. They're really kind of amenable to the insights to the data. They are having also the ways that different teams can discuss how to interpret certain data and also designate certain strategies. So I think it's not just the technical skills that are required or just the teaching skills, but I think also we need to have a bit of a cultural shift that is only way to convey certain transformation in that space.
Yeah, nice insights, Prof. So if I may add a bit to that question, Prof. Dragan, regarding how, if you may suggest, what is the best way to start with the transformation, especially on the governance, assuming that we can put the data in place, we can develop the model, and we can do the analysis, we can understand the pattern, and then it's the next step to embed that into our action model. Mm-hmm. So what is the best way before, this will be the stage before we reach the enculturation? So yeah. Any advice?
Well, I mean, there's a broad set of things that need to be done, right? To think about that. I think the key thing is if you're just purely talking about the teaching practice and how it can be informed by learning analytics, it really needs to always, any learning analytics need to be interpreted in terms of the frame of the learning design in which that learning analytics to be deployed, both in terms of the data that are being collected, as well as the insights and future interventions as well to be done. So that's why I'm trying to make certain suggestions about the intervention in a certain particular course where you don't have the expertise of the course instructor or the learning designer of that course. It's really almost mission impossible. They need to be the ones who have the knowledge of that context in which these type of things are happening. And you'd also hope that the learning designer would also have the knowledge of the best literature as well and the practices about human learning as well, so that they can translate that level of knowledge into the certain decisions that are happening there.
Interesting to hear about the decision there. Thank you, Prof. One more question that we received from Ki Manchua. I think he's from Sarawak. How to deal with trust issues of automatic feedback? Instructors seems to still manually check the automated AI-driven feedback to ensure they are meaningful or accurate. Maybe this is why it doesn't ease their workload. So this is a trust issue, Prof. How do we go about it?
Topic in learning analytics, trust. Obviously, students generally have much better trust when they actually see a human being, and we all have a tendency to just have trust in other human beings, and that's definitely part of it. I think in this case, maybe trust is a portion of the problem, and I think it could be. But I think the part of the problem here is that this existing instances of the automatic feedback is they are not really implementing the best practices and the recommendations from the literature, how feedback should look like. Like take, for example, John Hattie and Timberlake had their well-known paper, The Power of Feedback, in 2007, and they recently published also a meta-analysis, a follow-up of that paper. And they distinguished 4 levels of feedback, starting from the task level feedback, process feedback, self-regulation feedback, and the eventual feedback, which would be at the level of the self, certain encouragement, you're a good person, etc. And so what I found is that the task level feedback, this correctness, is only helpful and beneficial for students' learning if combined with either process level feedback or self-regulation feedback. And for students as well to get good level self-regulation feedback, they need to still improve their learning process before they can actually be improving their self-regulation. So what we have at the moment is we are just giving them the task level feedback, which is not sufficient. Just tells them you didn't do it right, but it doesn't tell them how to do it right next time, what steps they need to take to improve their learning and to basically next time better also understand certain problems and consequently better perform. So I think that's the critical challenge there, in addition, obviously, to trust. But I'd argue that this challenge is probably a bigger problem than just the trust itself. Although there's lots of room for trust questions to be asked in learning analytics, a lot. And we study that very extensively.
Oh, so in our context, Mr. Chua also responded to you. Very true, Prof. He agreed. But I also think that the first shift would be to recheck whether feedback is properly executed.
Well, yeah. Yeah, and I also mentioned some of these existing studies, like, for example, even when we are writing that feedback and also doing that feedback design of that tool as well, as we need to go back and ground it in the literature when we know what is the good practice of feedback. We often do many of these things because it's easy to be done. But it doesn't mean something is easy, something is useful. Many of us created in the past dashboards, and they are still creating dashboards because it's often easy to visualize many of these things. But it doesn't mean it's useful for the students. It could be useful for the teacher, but if you show it directly to the students, I mentioned some of these studies, it could be harmful.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Very insightful. I would like to have the session longer, but we have reached the end of our planned time. It has been an honor, Prof, being able to have a good, I would say it's a good discussion and learning, collecting many guides for future research in AI for learning analytics. I believe that many of the others also agree with me. And thank you again, Prof, for spending time and sharing with us your valuable insights and thoughts. I now pass the session to the MC. Prof, you are invited also to stay with us if you wish. After this, we are going to have a closing ceremony and IUCEL 2022 winners announcement. Thank you very much, Prof.